Welcome. How are you? So good to have you here today. I am Melissa Parks, and this is Dave Getz, and we are co-founders of Journey 66. And we are so happy that you're here and interested in capturing your family business story. We have known each other for about 25 years. That sounds really old when you say it's been almost a quarter of a century. Makes us feel very old. We met in a publishing company and did our first family business project about 15 years ago and have been serving families ever since then, and also the advisors who serve them. So we are passionate about helping families, and we hope today that you come away energized about capturing your own family business story before it slips away.
So today we're going to go through several slides. We have several activities as well. And we're just so grateful to the Prairie Family Business Association. We're a sponsor with them. And as far as we're concerned, they're the best organization serving families in North America that we know of. And so we're just grateful to be part of that. So today I hope you can find some practical help. Our goal is to give you both some insight, but also some basic next steps. We're also going to provide a tool to help you get started, a tool we call the timeline tool to help you just kind of begin to start the process of thinking about your family business story. So I think what we're going to do is we're going to dip in immediately, and I'm going to show my slide deck here. And we'll also give you this slide deck as you, hold on a sec while I get this. So we're going to provide the slide deck as well as some tools after this is over so that if there's something that you missed and you want to go back to, hopefully you can find it in the deck as well. So I'd like to begin today with a story of a founder that Melissa and I worked with. It was before COVID. And this founder lived on Seal Beach in California, which is this beautiful beach in Southern California. And the founder had started a very, very successful marketing agency. And it was kind of a dark time for him because he was dying. And we had met him through several referrals of some different family businesses. And so he wanted to write a book before he died. Now, when people tell their family business story, not everybody wants to do a book. Sometimes they want to do a documentary. Sometimes they just want to capture the stories in video, sometimes in written form. So there are a lot of different forms for your family business story, of which a book is just one. So, but he wanted to write a book, and he wanted to do it for his all the people in his company, as well as his the people that had been part of his life for his entire the time of his life. So we went to Seal Beach. It was this beautiful December 18th. In fact, Melissa was reminding me this morning it was December 18th, and December 18th in Chicago, where we live, is really cold. But December 18th in Southern California, it was so beautiful. It's that sun, pure sun. And we arrived a little bit early, so we walked down to the beach. We saw the body surfers. But then at 1 p.m., we met this gentleman at his condo there. He had several homes, and one of them was there in Seal Beach. And so we spent 2 hours, one of our first sessions with him, to begin to work on this project. And he had just started that day, interestingly enough, a new round of chemo. His cancer had returned. And so we spent 2 hours with him, and we could see him fading during the afternoon. And we finally quit at about 4 o'clock, and we said, you know what, let's just take the rest of the day off. He says, no, 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 no. I want to have dinner with you. He said, there's some other things I need to do. We need to get this out now. So he went to take a nap, and then Melissa and I just walked around town until we came back a couple hours later at a seafood restaurant in downtown Seal Beach. It was an amazing conversation because he could hardly hold his head up. I don't know. What do you remember about that
I remember
evening?
him speaking very quietly because he had lung cancer. And so to push through to tell these stories that we needed in order to tell his story was painful, you could tell. And so he would kind of have these shallow breaths, and then he would speak very softly because at one point the cancer was in his throat and he had part of his throat surgically removed. So it was just a very difficult time. But he persevered, and he knew that if not now, then never, because he had a clear sense that his mortality was waning.
And that often is the energy behind family business stories. And it just goes to show how important they are because you're trying to preserve something that if it doesn't get captured, it will indeed slip away.
So one of the key themes that you're going to hear us say a lot through this presentation is that the family business story, the journey to telling that and capturing that, is deeply missional. And your family business story matters. I had a conversation a few projects ago with somebody who worked for the family business. He wasn't a family member, but he worked for the family business in a vice presidential role. And when I was doing an interview with him, I said, why does this family business story matter? Why does this founder story matter? And he paused for a long time and he said, the next generation, I they don't know how hard it was. They don't understand how hard it is. I'm worried that they will not have the same values that this founder has and sustaining it into the next generation. So it really matters. The family business story matters in preserving those family values.
That reminds me, we did an interview with a woman named Kimberly Edelson, who oversees the Family Business Center at Northeastern University on the East Coast in Boston. She was talking about her work with Next Generation. And she said, one of the things that keeps coming up with the next generation, she said, that I don't know how to deal with, she said, is some, not all, tend to say it was luck that that created the successful family business. And I think in telling the family business story, certainly there were things that, opportunities that were taken, economic times, but I think the family business story will always reveal that it wasn't luck, right? It was incredible perseverance, incredible suffering sometimes, and really doing things against all odds. And so that really is what the family business story is. It's a set of values refined by fire, risk, uncertainty, even suffering and hardships.
we, we want to impart to you today that stories give meaning and context to today's family boardroom values. And I can't tell you how many boardrooms we've been in where they have framed a set of our values, our business values. And they're wonderful values. Generosity, professionalism, we stand by our word. These are all incredible values, but they become a little bit empty, and people don't really know, what does it mean to be generous? When this family business says we're a generous family, what does that actually mean? And the family business stories give the context and the meaning for those values that the family business holds today and continues to sustain them into the future.
So today we want to cover three things. What is the family business story? I think that's a really important thing. It sounds kind of simple, but um, I
We're
think
going to make some distinctions, right?
we'll make a few distinctions, yeah. And who is the family business story for? This is really important. And then where do you start? We definitely want to provide you with some practical stuff so you can take away something and begin to work on your family business story if, in fact, that is something that you want to do. So, what is a family business story?
So when we work with family businesses to tell their story, they often confuse it with family history. And while family history is a part of your family business story, it is not the family business story, right? You can think of like ancestry.com, and family history kind of recounts the facts and the dates, and it's more reporting. Whereas a family business story is that it's a story. And while there are historical facts from the family, perhaps where they migrated from, some of those early days that informed the founder and how he came or she came to be, it's not the reporting that's important, but it's the stories that are important.
So I think as we begin to talk about the family business story, we often will use the analogy of a memoir. And a memoir, I don't know if you even know what a memoir is. I'm not sure I knew one, 10, 15 years ago, but a memoir is a memory that someone has of a specific stretch in their life. So a person can have many family memoirs. So a family business story isn't a memoir. It's about the memory of the family business story, but it is like a memoir. So we often say, what's an example of a memoir? Some of you may have remembered or may remember Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. So it's really a Holocaust survivor's reflections on finding meaning and purpose in the Holocaust while being, in turn, even though he went through deep suffering. So it's a story. And I think that's what's important is we liken it to a memoir that your family business story is a story. It's a memory of your family business.
One other small point that we'll make about how family business stories are like memoirs, and that is that when you read a memoir, there's meaning attached to the stories that are told. It's not just a story for a story's sake, but there's usually some sort of reflection and interpretation that the author is doing. And now if you're doing a video, the narration does that for you as well. But a family business story is similar in that there's going to be reflection by the person who's writing it, and they're going to say this happened, and when this happened, this changed, and it changed for maybe not the best, or maybe for the best, but there's this reflection that's continually happening. So you're interpreting it for the reader, and it's the entire story revolves around central themes that come up over and over again. And we like to say that the best stories are made up of a bunch of smaller stories that the viewer, the reader, can immerse themselves in, right? If you think of the best stories that you've read over the years, whether it's a novel or maybe it's a great Netflix series, the ones that you want to stick with to the end are those where you're invested in the characters and you get to know the characters and they overcome adversity and you're rooting for them and you see yourself in them and you think, man, I don't know if I could have done that, or man, that inspires me to do something different. So when you think about telling your business story, whatever form that takes, think of it in terms of stories, scenes, characters. And when you bring those things to life, it becomes more than just a history.
It becomes really, really interesting. And I'm trying to think of one family business story that we've done through the years that wasn't incredibly interesting.
Right.
And maybe you feel a little insecure and you think, well, maybe our family business story isn't all that interesting. And I'm telling you that every family business story is interesting because there's drama, there's risk, there's uncertainty. This is a really important point too. I think that a family business story has a point of view, right? It's the narrator, the person telling the story. And in a founder, sometimes there are what are called founder memoirs. So the founder is still around and he or she will wants to tell the story. But most family business stories aren't like that. They're not in the first person. I did that and then I did that. Those are kind of hard to read. We've done a few of those, and you have to be really careful that it doesn't become like what's called a hagiography, which is the writing of the saints, a very heroic story, because that's inherently not interesting. And it's also not true, right? It's not true. The family business story is epic, right? It's played out on a life stage, on a big life stage. I often say that every family business story we've ever worked with, small or large, has been epic because there's things at stake. So most family business stories will be told in what's called the third person. So if you read a novel, sometimes there'll be a narrator telling the story. In a sense, that's how many or most family business stories. It's certainly true if the second or third generation is telling a story. They're telling it they want to tell the stories, and it's still really engaging, but it's not the I. And you can have founder stories or founder family business stories that can be interesting, but generally they tend to be done in the third person. It just becomes a really a better way to tell the story.
I'll just make this point again. We've already touched on it, but what makes your family business story engaging is when the reader is so invested in the characters, your family members, that they identify with them and feel deeply about what is at stake. And they, in turn, want to sustain the business. So if the reader is future generations, then they become so invested in what the previous generations have done, and they are invested in, them overcoming, that they kind of catch that bug to want to do the same. So you want your reader to feel what your family felt. And this is actually a picture of the founder of one of the companies that we wrote a family story for. And I'll let you tell this
So
story.
this was in 1907 was when the company was founded. The same year we like to say is when the Chicago Cubs won the World Series. The first time before 2016, they hadn't won a World Series since then. So this was 1907. But you fast forward. So we're going to talk about this in a little bit. We talk about how to structure and how to begin to work on your family story. So we're going to give you some very practical stuff. But talking about what's really engaging, this story became really engaging in 1955. Generation Two was running the business at this time, and they had a major fire. It was 1955, and it wiped out their entire fleet of trucks.
So just a little bit of background. They were a coal supplier for heating, and then in the 50s they moved to oil
That's
delivery.
right. No, that's
Okay.
really important. So, but they were in the fuel delivery business, and so as fuel changed from coal, they began to deliver oil, and then they had a fleet of trucks. So the business continued up. So this is basically 50 years later. The story is 50 years later. They had this major fire, lost all their trucks. A few days later, after the fire, they went to an association that they were part of in Chicago called the Oil Man's Association. And we have a video because we interviewed by video generation three, and some of them still had memories of the fire, but they were very young. And they said they remember the smell of the fire. They remember going to the fire, which was so awesome.
Remembering, not the
Just
fire.
yeah, not the fire. They're remembering their memories were so awesome. They remember wondering how is our family going to make it. I mean, real fear. They lost their entire fleet of trucks. And a couple days later, this oil man association, their two top competitors came in and said to them, we'll service all of your customers until you get back on your feet. I'm emotional talking about it, right? Well, that is an incredible story. And that generosity by those two competitors became deeply embedded in this family. So today, when you look at their boardroom families, their boardroom values, and you see them sitting on, and one of them is generosity to all, that's not a platitude. That came out of great suffering in a time in which somebody showed generosity to them. It was because of their value of generosity. It's a great example of a family business value that generations want to persist into the next generation. And the only way to tell that story and to get that to persist is to tell the story, right? Is to create the story and make sure that the next generation hears the story, understands where the value came from. There was a kind of a, oh, by the way, to the story as well, the
Yeah.
IOUs.
Yeah, so in the 1930s, the founder was in the coal delivery business, and a lot of people couldn't pay their bill for the coal, but it was the middle of winter, they needed heat. And so he had people write out IOUs, and it was an incredibly generous act because, of course, his family was going through the Depression as well. And he talked about to the next generation how there was not one person who did not pay him back. Now, this is just a tiny little story that one of the grandchildren remembered, but it showed that even before that fire, there was a generous spirit within that family. And then when this fire happened and it was demonstrated to them, it only compounded that value and made it even more important. So just a word of caution, because we work with a lot of families who are afraid of the skeletons in the closet coming out. And we just want to reassure you and your family that the purpose of a family business story is not to tell the deepest, darkest secrets of the family. The purpose of a family story is to unify the family at its best. That's what it will do. And those family secrets, it can fray the family, it can disintegrate the family. And so we view telling family business stories in a very positive way. Now, there's a place for some of those harder moments, but we have some words of caution about that and how to gauge whether or not it's a good idea to include those stories.
Well,
So
we have two key questions. Certainly one is, do I have permission to tell this story, especially if the person is living? Uh, um, we've had, first generation people who've been concerned about a story. We've had second generation family members who were concerned about the first generation telling a story because it affected them. And the fear was, would they tell what happened to us when we were teenagers or whatever? And so there's this fear. And so again, just to allay that fear, that's not the purpose of a family business story. A great story needs to talk about risk, uncertainty, things that worked, things that didn't. But the family business story is not about destroying the family. It's the absolute antithesis of that. It's to strengthen the family and to make sure that the values persist. So that's why this is not a family history, right? It's a family business story. So we should tell about this
yeah.
story, and you work probably most closely with him because he made the decision to tell something that was probably a little bit salacious. So this is an example of someone who wanted to tell certain things because it did affect the purpose of writing the family business story.
Right. So this gentleman was an Orthodox Jewish businessman who came from South Africa. His family before him were persecuted in Latvia and migrated to South Africa. And ultimately, he immigrated to the United States when he sold his oil business that he founded to a German conglomerate. He wrote this book. It was called Zaidi, which is Yiddish for grandfather for his grandchildren. And um, it's really interesting because it's chapter 5. There were 10 chapters. Chapter 5, smack dab in the middle of the book, was called Mistakes and Second Chances. And in this chapter, he highlights 5 mistakes that he made and he regretted enormously. And one of them being an affair that he had with his previous wife's first cousin, who ended up becoming his wife. And he told that story not because it was salacious and sensational. In fact, it was kind of risky for him to divulge this kind of vulnerable part about himself. But he did so because it wasn't the mistake that mattered, but how he rectified that mistake and the value of making things right that he wanted his grandchildren to understand deeply when they read this as an adult. So there are times in which you can add some of those details if you have permission. Obviously, this was the founder and he gave himself permission, and I'm sure he spoke with his wife about it and she gave permission as well. And if it's for a larger purpose, right? And in this case, it aligned with what his purpose was, and it was very much value driven.
So that really is a nice transition into the next more practical section of our time together. And this might seem patently obvious, and if it does, I apologize for that in advance. But as you think about your family business story, it's really important to slow down and really write out and get really crisp and clear on why are we doing this and why now? Why does it matter? And so this purpose, as Melissa just mentioned with the Zadie story, the purpose for that book was for his grandchildren to tell this family business story to his grandchildren, which is why he included the mistakes. To be honest with you, we felt really uncomfortable in putting this project together because we're like, oh, really? You're going to tell that story? And he said, yes, we did. And so it was done really delicately. It wasn't written salaciously, but he had a really clear purpose in mind. So families who create their family business story, it's really important that you get really clear on your passion, on the why. And the other one, the story that I told at the beginning, his name is Randy Brewer. He felt really passionate about generosity and how it changed his life and others. That's why he could spend that time and be so fierce while he was exhausted and really, it felt like he was near death at that dinner when we were eating at the seafood restaurant. But that's the kind of purpose and clarity that I think will really help you as you think about putting together the family business story. So go ahead.
And I'll just reiterate this point, and it goes along with what you're saying. When you have a strong sense of purpose, you have a rudder for your project. And we've heard a lot of our clients come to us and say, yeah, somebody said we should write our family business story. And that's wonderful. I'm sure the story is compelling if somebody's telling you to write it. There are probably some valuable lessons that the next generation needs to hear, maybe the community at large needs to hear. But if you don't have a strong sense of purpose, then you will likely struggle in those dark moments where you feel like this project is never going to get done. You have family members saying, do we really need to do this? Do we need to really dedicate some resources to this? When you have a purpose, it will get done. And speaking of Randy Brewer again, he got that book done within 3 months because he knew that his mortality was facing him directly in the face. And so it gave him a huge sense of purpose and urgency. So death doesn't have to motivate you, though it often, somebody's mortality does often motivate them to capture the story, but you do have to have a real sense of purpose. That becomes your rudder.
And so I think this deeper sense of purpose does give you the best chance of really influencing the next generation. And you had mentioned this earlier, Melissa, it's the meaning of your business story that matters. It's not just the business story, right? It's the so what. So why does it matter? It matters usually because there's a set of values that were refined by fire that the family wants to persist into future generation. That's why they call all this conversation about family business stories is really legacy stuff. So a well-defined purpose will do one other thing for you, and that is it will really help you identify who is this project for. Again, I want to say just because you want to tell your family business story does not mean you're going to write a book or you're going to do a documentary. It doesn't mean that at all. It might mean simply putting up a website, as I mentioned earlier. There's just a lot of different forms that a family business story can take. So we don't want to imply that it's somehow a book or it's somehow a video, it can be a bunch of different things. But most families originally, when we begin working with them, they do it out of a need to have these values persist into the next generation. And they might have a CEO who's the son or the daughter in the next gen. And they want to make sure that what was learned in that initial generation, or it might be generation three, that has never really solidified and captured generations one's value, but they are very important. And there's multiple reasons. But the question always is, who is this project for? And this is often true, the project initially begins something we need to do for the family. And then with these businesses continuing, it morphs into, hey, we think this, you know what? let's just let's I think our employees need to read this, or I think our suppliers need to read this, or we have these longtime customers that have been with us for 50 years. We would love to provide this as a gift to them and as thanks. So there's all these different reasons. So if you have a really clear purpose early on, it will really help you decide who the project is for.
So we have a small group today, but we were hoping at this point, if you are considering capturing your family business story, to take just a few minutes to reflect on my purpose for wanting to write our family business story is, and our family business story is for, and just take a few minutes to think about that. And if you feel comfortable sharing it with who is here, we would love to hear from you. So we'll just let you take a few minutes to wrestle with that, and then we'll be back. Maybe Dave, if you were to write your family business, your family story,
Where there's my business story.
or your business story.
Yeah. So what would be the purpose? I think it's those darn kids, right? You want them to go, this was harder than you thought it was. No, it's probably not. It's probably more than that. But I think um, the purpose often is to kind of get it down, get the stories down so that they're actually recorded, no matter what the form is. For me, that would be true. They need to know how hard it was from 2000 to 2003 when, my wife and I took all of our family resources to start the business. We took our retirement accounts, we took equity out of our home. The founding story is really good. Then we can talk about those really good years between kind of 2003 to 2010. Some we got hit by that financial crisis where it became impossible to land new clients for a while. 2007, 2008 was the Great Recession, but it didn't hit my business until really until 2010. But anyway, enough of me. Don't want to talk about. But those would be back to tentpole scenes. Those would be two: the founding story, and then of course what happened after we had really done well for a while, and then got hit by the recession. So knowing what the purpose is so important, and knowing who the business is for. So
business stories.
yeah, the business story is for.
Does anybody feel like sharing? No pressure.
No pressure.
I'll share. Just because I'm thinking, so I work at Prairie Family Business Association, but my parents are also members because they own a ranch, and I usually just think about their story and how impactful it is, and I think so often that our stories are lost because when a generation dies, then everything that they knew before if they didn't share the story, or if you didn't write it down or don't remember all the stories, then it's lost. And so I have no interest in carrying on the ranch, but I have a 16-year-old son that does. And so how do we capture the grit and the hardship and the perseverance that my parents have gone through in order to maintain? My dad's third generation, and so my son would be fifth generation of this land.
Wow.
And and allow that to be a story that my son can hold on to and hopefully carry on, to his future children.
Yeah.
So
Wow, fifth generation. Oh my gosh, that's incredible.
That gave me goosebumps.
Yeah. Oh my
Yeah,
gosh.
that's
Yeah.
awesome.
And the fact that he's 16 and wants to do
Mhm.
that's incredible. That's an incredible what's a great purpose. My
Great
gosh.
purpose, yeah.
yeah.
Anybody else feel like sharing?
Well, we'll keep moving. So how and where to start? So there's so much to talk about that you just simply can't talk about in an hour-long workshop or webinar, but we do want to begin and give you some tools to kind of start the process, because this is one of the reason our name is called Journey 66 is that you can see the sign behind us. It comes from Route 66, and if you know anything about Route 66, it starts in Chicago. There's that highway system that started in Chicago. I think it was 1927. Started right at the waterfront in Chicago and goes all the way through southern United States to
Santa Monica.
up here at Santa Monica. And it was John Steinem or Steinem, that's Gloria Steinem. John Steinbeck wrote the book, The Grapes of Wrath, and he called Route 66 the Mother Road. So we like to say that if you're going to write your family business story, it's like a journey from Chicago to Santa Monica. It'll take you a little bit. There's some milestones along the way, and it's really worth the trip. So the first thing, why don't you talk about our basic timeline?
And Allison will drop this into the chat. We have a link to a Google document, and you can use that at your will freely. And it's just a basic timeline. It's a simple tool. And if you find a different method for doing it, that's great. The idea, though, is to create a basic timeline. And we like to divide it up into 4 different periods. And it's the pre-founding years. There's obviously this period of what led up to the founding of the business. And those are really interesting things to include because it informs the founder and their decision to step foot into this new territory. And then you have the founding years, and those are exciting years. They're often really hard years, risky years. There are a lot of wonderful stories. There's always so much excitement around this period when you're close to it. So when we interview founders, of course, when you get to the 3rd or 4th generation, those founding years are a little bit blurrier. And then after the founding years, you have the growth years, and that is generally a pretty long period. And there are significant moments and then some minor moments that you can point to and think, yeah, this really shaped the family business. And then we like people to consider like even present stories and how the business is even evolving today, and the family is evolving today, because family business can turn into a family enterprise, and it becomes so much bigger than what it once was. So those are the four categories, and we suggest when you do this to just jot down as many memories and stories as you can, and just shorthand. You don't need to put details in at this point. It's just to jog your memory. And obviously this is going to be incomplete, because so much of this process is you going back as far as you can to people who are still alive and asking them questions and getting stories that you have no recollection of. But you may have heard some stories in passing and you're like, yeah, I think this is a story. I don't know the details, but it definitely was an important one. And I know that we've told it at family barbecues quite a few times, so this should definitely be included. And so identify them and put them in the different periods. And after that, the next thing we're going to discuss is identifying whether or not they are major scenes, major stories, or minor stories. Um, we like to call major stories tent pole scenes. And if you think of a tent, they have poles, and I've been in a tent where like the tent is collapsed because the poles weren't in appropriately. But tent pole scenes give your story structure. They're what hold it together, and it creates pacing, it creates energy, because usually these major moments or tent pole scenes are when something is really at stake. There's high risk. Maybe something happened to one of the leaders in the family business, and it revectors the direction of the company. It's usually one of those moments where the leaders of the family business are like, oh no, what's next? So if you think of temple scenes as moments when something was at stake, and it could have gone one of two directions, but it went one particular direction and it changed the entire course of the family business. So think of the major scenes and the minor scenes, and these are going to take up more space in either your video or your book, if you choose to write a book. But then you're going to have all these little minor stories. If you think of the generosity story that we told earlier, obviously that fire story is a major story that talks about how that value of generosity was shaped. But then there was that minor story, the IOUs during the Depression, which is a minor story that really speaks to that, and how that value has transcended from the very beginning to even now. So you can begin to think of, is this a major moment in our family history, or is it a minor? Was it what? And then even say, what was at risk? There's a third column where we ask you to start to identify the significance of these stories. And again, just jot it down. Like, what lessons did the family learn during the most stressful years of the business? What do you want future generations to glean or take away from this moment? What were the family dynamics, and what did you learn about how you interacted with people and how the family fits into the business? These are all kind of questions that you should be asking as you think of these major and minor stories. What's the significance? Because ultimately, you want to take the reader, the viewer, however you're packaging this, on a journey to discovery and understanding and a deeper sense of purpose. And you do that by helping them identify the significance in the stories.
We've worked with families where they took on risk and they had failure, but that failure prompted them to do something different, which then changed the trajectory of the business. That would probably be a tentpole scene. There's a tentpole scene in a family business that we've done. I think it was like, gosh, it was before COVID, maybe 2018, where they had hired some consultants to come in, and they actually listened to the consultants, and it completely revectored the business. It moved them from being a small, not poorly run, but more of a kind of a really family shop, and it just professionalized everything. But it changed their whole trajectory in terms of the revenue of the business, how they grew over the next 10 to 20 years. That's also a tentpole scene. So every family business that has survived and thrived for a couple generations has these tentpole scenes. So it's really important that you think about those, identify those. And here's the thing, and there's going to be so many holes in what you know and what you're trying to find. And so part of the journey in putting this together is, yeah, part of the journey in keeping this in making this happen is trying to figure out how do you find more information on the holes. A good example would be, Callie, for example, you don't just talk to your mom and dad, but the uncles that are still alive, right? The cousins that are still alive, maybe someone that worked for your father and mother, that is still alive. And you also will need to maybe research to really understand how bad it was in 1937, to understand do some research on the economic times in South Dakota, north central South Dakota. I know where your parents are from, because my parents are from the Selby Mobridge area. And so, but you can tell, but that's the kind of research that helps you fill in the details as you begin to think about telling the story. So research consists of interviews, it's company records, it might be any documents that you have, newspapers, clippings. It's amazing. And today, which is so sad, there isn't the local journalism that there used to be. But my guess is that your family appeared in the paper for different reasons throughout the years, hopefully all positive. Um, but uh, but those are great sources, and what they do is they raise new questions to ask your mom and dad. Like, hey, I just saw this. What was going on during that time? Like, what was at stake? Like, what was really happening? What was happening to some of your neighbors at the time? So the journey to research your family story is just that. It's a Route 66, right? And you get to 1 mile marker and you realize, oh man, I got to go another 20 miles this direction to get the research and get the real stories that I want.
And again, that comes back to your purpose and having a rudder. So we have 2 key activities to get you started, and obviously we're scratching the surface here, but if you just do these 2 activities, you're going to make a whole lot of headway, because when you have your purpose statement, you're going to have that rudder that you need to sustain the journey from Chicago to Santa Monica. And then the other one is to complete that timeline as fully as possible, and then begin to identify what the major stories are and the minor stories are, and also identify those people who you need to start interviewing. That will get you like the next 20 miles in the mile marker, right? It may actually get you like 250 miles, because that research will open doors to other stories that you may not be aware of, and other people that you should be interviewing. So if you do these 2 things, you are going to be making a huge amount of headway. Now, obviously, once you've done the research, you're pretty solid on what your major and minor stories are. Then there's a whole issue of structuring and the actual doing of the work. And that's for a whole other workshop.
I'll give you this tip though, that when we do projects, so sometimes if you say, well, we want to do a series of interviews, video interviews with key family members so that we can capture the story. Sometimes that's the final deliverable. It's not a book, it's not really a documentary, it's just a series of videos. So in projects like that, we don't do any of those shoots until we've done a ton of research. Because if you do those video shoots too early, or those even audio interviews too early, you don't know the right questions to ask. So our rule of thumb is make sure that you do your research first, so that when you're doing the actual interviewing, whether it's audio, whether it's video, you're really organized to capture those major stories, and that you don't just let them ramble on. Now, rambling on is good because sometimes they'll give you additional information. But if you will hear those stories before you actually do the video interview or you do the audio interview, whatever the form is that you have, you'll really capture the good stuff because you'll be able to press them in the interview. So earlier you mentioned the color of the sky the night that the hail came and destroyed all the crops. Could you just give us some more description? That kind of detail is what makes these stories so powerful. So do the research first before you do the story capturing. and take longer than you think on the research because it feels like you're really slowing down. Let me give you a stupid example. I am somebody they used to call me blow and go because when I was going to college and working through graduate school, I worked for a commercial painter and I led these big projects for them, but they always criticized me. My boss always criticized because I'd like start working before we had laid down tarps. So they'd always have to go back and clean up. They call me blow and go because I wouldn't do the necessary prep time before actually doing the work itself. So this is a good example of don't blow and go, slow down to make sure
Slow and go.
slow and go. Yeah, there you go. Slow and go, slow and go. So to do the research first and then capture your and then do the actual capturing of the stories. And you'll end up with a much different product no matter what it is that you want to capture and do.
So if you are interested in taking that journey and you still want support along the way, we're starting a 12-month family business story cohort. And the purpose is simply to help families make progress on their family business story step by step. And it's a 12-month cohort, and it's peer learning and support. You'll get assignments and feedback along the way, and it meets once a month by Zoom. So we'll take you through all the steps that we're alluding to right now, all the way up to that writing and production phase.
And it's for not just one person, but as many of your family members that you want to participate. They may not all be able to participate on every call, but we want to do it with multiple families so the families can learn from each other. And there'll be assignments, we'll give feedback. And it's just very, very practical because there's all these questions that come up that are just so normal. And so we'll be starting that sometime in October. There'll be more information about that, but we just wanted to say that this is something that we've been continually asked for. Is there some sort of peer learning that we can do together and learn and get support and actually march us so that at the end of it, we're farther along Route 66 than we were at the beginning because this is not something you can do in a weekend or even a month, given that everybody's working full time. So any questions that we can answer from the two of you, we'd love to answer any questions that you have.
This is Renee. I was wondering when you were talking about capturing the story on video, who would ask the questions?
That's a great question, Renee. So I think you need to look for the quality of the person, right? It's not like, I think it can be a family member if the person is curious, if they come prepared, if they've done the research, if they know how to ask the follow-up question. They obviously have to have a warm presence to make people feel comfortable. That's a huge part of these video shoots, is making sure that there's somebody there that makes the people being interviewed at ease, because it's very uncomfortable being on camera if you're not used to it. So sometimes you know an outsider, and sometimes the outsider is better because they aren't blinded by the obvious, right? And so they can, what's obvious to a family member isn't obvious to them, and they're able to ask that follow-up question. So there are outsiders. Maybe it's somebody that is just a naturally curious person, and they ask great questions of you. They might be somebody that you could enlist. And obviously there are professionals also who can help you with that, video production companies and editorial services company.
So I was thinking about this for myself. I was thinking that probably my brother-in-law would be good, that he was a former high school teacher, and now he leads a foundation for a family here, actually in the offices where we are. But he is so naturally curious, and so he would not make the interview about him. And so that's another really important trait. Sometimes you get a family member and they want to, hey, remember that too. And if you're trying to actually do the actual official interviews, you need a set of questions, and then they need to be trained to explain to them that the best stuff is going to come when you ask that follow-up question. Like I said, so, you remember that summer night when the hail came and destroyed the wheat crop right before harvest. What was the sky like? Like, what do you remember about that night? And they'll say something. And then to ask that follow-up question, what did you feel like? Like, what do you remember thinking? How did you feel right after that? You know, those types of questions really capture great content. So finding someone who's curious, but also sure you're prepared with a set of questions, but also instructions and really educate the person who's doing the interview about what you expect and the importance of curiosity, the importance of detail, because it's that detail that really makes a story pop and makes it memorable.
I'll also mention that when you do the interviews, you've done all these pre-interviews to identify what stories you really want to dig into. The other stories will come up. It's also helpful to prep the people who you're interviewing, say, you know, these are the questions that I'm going to be asking. These are the stories I want to cover, so that it's fresh in their mind. They come prepared. Obviously, you don't want it to be too scripted. If you know, too scripted means then that they're shutting off that part of the brain that kind of is more instinctual and remembers the really interesting nuances. But some sort of preparation just makes the participants feel more confident and comfortable coming into the interview.
You know, with today, everything video or audio gets edited. If you're doing a book, it's a little different because you can select what came out of the interview, so it doesn't have to be as polished in the moment. I was thinking about making sure you talk to, like in a family business, making sure you talk to former employees who are now retired, who were in significant positions. I think I mentioned the CFO in the conversation. Did I mention that?
did.
Oh, you did, yeah. So there was gosh, 4 or 5 years ago with the family that we did they wanted to interview the CFO who was now retired, and we did it together with the original founder, and the two of them started spawning these stories that singly they weren't able to come up with, but together go, oh, you remember that? And it was really a wonderful time. So sometimes it's putting two people together, especially if you're taking that content and writing a book, which is more written as opposed to like a video shoot or an audio
Where you want it more produced.
yeah, where you want it more produced. So there's all these things to consider.
Any other questions? All right. Well, we thank you so much for giving us an hour of your time today. It was so much fun to hear about your family story, Callie, and also just share with you how to begin this journey. And we look forward to hearing from you by email of how you're making progress. And if you have any questions, you know, like 2 days from now, shoot, I wish I would have asked that. Feel free to email us and we'd be happy to answer those for you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.